Today is all about black and white editing, and I want to go through a few different examples of what sort of images make a good black and white, have a look at how to transform a color photo into a black and white, and the sort of things to look out for. The 4 images that I have selected here, there's a lot of similarities, even though they're very, very different. There's a lot of highlights and there's a lot of shadows. And when it comes to choosing the right images to convert into black and whites, that's something that we need to consider. So if you have a very flat image and there's not a lot of difference between the highlights and shadows in your photo, then a black and white can lose its punch. When we look at a color image like this, we see all of the beautiful warmth, we see all those skin tones that really do separate the curves and the shapes of the baby's body. We see all of the, the highlights and shadows within the hair as well. The minute we take away all of that color, we tend to look at the photo very differently. It can lose its punch, it can lose its I suppose that impact that we look for in a photo that really does hold our gaze, our attention. So if we think about, all of the beautiful color that we can see in photos and how we feel when we look at a photo with color, then when we're converting images to black and white, we've got to consider how we can create that same level of impact. Now it's going to be slightly different with all of our images. So I'm going to go across here, and what I'm going to do is, let's just flatten that very quickly, create a hue and saturation layer here with all of our images so that we can see exactly what I'm referring to. So something like this that has got lots of contrast in terms of that really bright background and then those dark shadows in the foreground, that's going to have more punch than an image that doesn't have all of that. And if I convert my screen here in the background to white, then you can see that's a really kind of flat image now. The baby sort of tends to get quite lost within that scene. The black lines really stand out. However, the baby looks really quite flat. And so what we have to do with these sort of images is bring out more of those highlights and shadows to try and create that impact that we're talking about. And the same with this image, it has a really dark background. So when I am looking at converting something like this to a black and white, I've got to be conscious of losing some of that detail in those darker shadowy areas so that when we do create that impact with those highlights and shadows, we do push them and enhance them in our editing process. We've got to be careful that we're not losing some of that detail. Because if we have a look over here at our histogram, we can see that there's a lot of information sort of to the left of our histogram, which means it's very dark. And so once we start to sort of bump things like contrast to create the impact that we're looking for, we can lose a lot of information. So that's something to be very mindful of. So a few things that I like to consider when I'm looking at black and whites is obviously that impact that we're talking about. But when I choose an image to convert to black and white, I want it to have a really good tonal range from its highlights and its shadows. I want it to have contrast. I want there to be blacks and I want there to be whites. When we look at a photo like this, we have within this particular photo a lot of information, as you can see in the histogram, sitting over to that right-hand side, and you can see how it's all grouped together in the histogram. That means there's a lot of information that is very similar in tone. So we're going to work on how we can adjust those tones to really bring out the detail and give it that impact where the baby is. Even with an image like this, you can see that histogram, we've got some beautiful shadows down here. Now those shadows are going to be the baby's hair and some of these darker areas down to sort of the right-hand side of the baby there where the light has been blocked. So you're going to have some information in the shadows, but the majority of that information there is sort of sitting just to the right of those midtones. So we've got a lot of similar tones there. So as we look at the different histograms, then we can see exactly what we're working with here. This really sort of thin amount of information here, it's a small amount of information there right up where those highlights are. That's our background. The rest of the information that we're going to be working with is pushing towards those darker shadows. So we're going to look at how we can control those, but still, you know, bring out, you know, increase those blacks to really give it some depth, but bring out some detail in some more of those midtones and not lose that detail to be able to create a beautiful print, which ideally is what I'm doing every time I open a photo to edit it, because I want it to have lots of detail, right from those dark shadows through to those very, very bright highlights, especially when I'm working with black and whites, because they can be, believe it or not, very hard to print well. For me, when I'm printing a black and white award image, I have to be very, very careful with the different types of papers that I choose, because if you start to lose detail in those blacks, then the printer that you use, the profiles that you use, the paper that you use can really struggle to make sure it continues to keep all of that detail in that final print. And a lot of different papers can suck the ink out and lose that punch, lose that contrast that we want to try and create between the highlights and shadows, and it can look quite blocked up and muddy in a lot of those black, sort of darker areas of our images. So that's why when I am editing, I am very conscious of my histogram and how I'm working with the information that I've got in front of me. So when I'm looking at a beautiful portrait like this that has got lots of highlights and lots of shadows, I'll often, just for at the very beginning of my image, just to give my eye a reference point, I'll often convert my background to white like this, because I want to see, if I was to print this on a piece of white paper, where those highlights should sit. Do I want them to be completely blown out? And I'm looking at my histogram and I can already identify that that tone there is not white. It's not the same tone as my background here in Photoshop. This information here has got some detail in it. That's why it's sitting to the left of the end of that histogram, just inside it, and there's no information hitting the absolute end. If it was hitting the end, if there is information all the way up here, and let's just say, for example, you know, we push all of that information up. Hang on a minute. I'll do it here to make it a little bit more visible so you can see it. So if I was to push all of that information up, then I'm going to start to lose, and you can see it happening over here, I'm going to start to lose all of that information as I push it further to the right and it disappears. So it's no longer going to print any information. So when you're working with a very high key backlit shot like this, then that becomes your choice as to whether or not you want to print those highlights. If you want it to be sort of, you know, grey on a white backdrop, on a white piece of paper, or in a white frame, or whether or not you want it to be nice and crisp and white and have that punch in terms of that contrast. So that's the only time I will push my highlights like this, is if I'm working with a backlit image. So most of the time I really do want to try and control that information and keep detail so that when I am printing, it's going to print something on the paper. But often, if you do have a very contrasting image with information that is very bright and with information that is very dark like this, but there is detail in your highlights, let's just say, for example, a wedding dress, then you want to keep detail. You definitely don't want to push any of that information like I just did. When it's flat like this and it's backlit, that's when I would push the information to try and blow out some of those highlights. But definitely not if there is any form of texture or pattern in those highlights that are very, very bright.